if you've looked at the fraction freak show video, you recognize that what we have here is we have an addition problem. We have Addie. And Addie and Subby, whenever they're around, they like to be in the same pair of pants, which means the bottoms have to be the same. That's what a pair of pants is. And that's the denominator in a fraction. So these denominators, before we can add the fractions, have to be the same. So what we want to look at in this video is how do we figure out what that common pair of pants, that pair of pants that's big enough for the two fractions to fit into, how do we figure out what that pair of pants is, that common pair of pants? Now, sometimes we can just recognize what that common pair of pants is. Isn't the pair of pants 15 a pair of pants that will hold a 5 as a factor? Isn't 5 a factor of 15 if we think about the video, the other video that hopefully you viewed, that video that describes the concepts of factor and multiple? 5 is a factor of 15 because 5 will divide into 15. So this pair of pants is big enough for the two fractions. So in this case, the common denominator we could use is 15. And there are times where we can simply look at the two denominators and we can pick out the pair of pants that's big enough, the common denominator, the common multiple. If one number is a factor of the other, then the larger number can be used as the common denominator. Well, suppose we have these two fractions. In this case, neither denominator is a factor of the other. So neither pair of pants is big enough for the other one to divide into it and give us a whole number answer. You can't divide 10 into 12. 10 is not a multiple of 12. You can't divide 10 into 12 and get a whole number answer. 10 is not a factor of 12. 12 is not a multiple of 10, either way you want to say it. And 12 is not a factor of 10. You can't divide 12 into 10 and get a whole number answer. So neither of these pair of pants are big enough. So how would we find the pair of pants that would be big enough for these two fractions so that we can add them together? Well, I want to show you a technique that we can use to always find the common denominator to use for two denominators when we are adding or subtracting fractions. What we do is this. We take the product of the two denominators and divide by the greatest factor they have in common. So if we think about the factors, remember, a factor is a number that we'll divide into. If we think about the common factors that 10 and 12 share, the common factor they share is 2. So we're going to take the product of those two numbers and divide by 2. 10 times 12 is 120, and 120 divided by 2 equals 60. So in adding those two fractions, we would have to use 60 as that common denominator, that pair of pants that both fractions can fit into. So before we can add those fractions, we're going to have to transform them into equivalent fractions that have a denominator of 60. And we'll look at how to do that in a later video. Let's look at another example of finding the common denominator. Here's a subtraction. And remember, the twins Addie and Subby, addition and subtraction is where we have to have the same denominator. So we need to find the common denominator for 15 and 20. So let's again use that technique. We're going to take the product of 15 and 20. We're going to take the product of the two denominators and then divide by the greatest factor they have in common, the greatest common factor between 15 and 20. Well, what's the largest number that you can divide into 15 and 20 and get a whole number answer? Well, that would be 5, wouldn't it? 5, 15, and 20 both share the common factor of 5. 15 times 20 is equal to 300, and 300 divided by 5 is equal to 60. So the common denominator we would use for these two fractions would again be 60. And we will have to learn how to transform these fractions into new fractions with 60 as their denominator so that we can then subtract them. Because remember, addition and subtraction require the same pair of pants, require a common denominator. Let's look at one more example of finding a common denominator for two fractions. What if we were subtracting these fractions? 7/15 minus 7/18. Remember, it's only the twins, Addie and Subby, that have to have the same pair of pants, that have to have the same denominator. So we're going to find the common denominator. We're going to do that by taking the product of the two denominators that are there and dividing by the greatest common factor they share. Remember, a factor is a number that will divide into. Well, 3 will divide into both 15 and 18, won't it? 15 times 18, that's going to give us, I think, 270. And 270 divided by 3 is 90. So the common denominator we would use when we would be subtracting these two fractions would be the common denominator of 90. And when we look at subtraction, we will look at how we have to transform those two fractions into fractions that have 90 as their denominator before we can perform the subtraction. So here's our technique to find the common denominator, the common pair of pants when we're adding and subtracting. We take the product of the denominators and divide by the greatest common factor the two denominators share. And that will give us the common denominator we can use.